Hello. So for my Curiosities and Context assignment, I was tasked with analyzing historical and literary allusions in the poem The Raven that are not the Raven, because we can talk about the symbolic, literary, biblical implications of the Raven all day, but some of the other things that Poe mentions in the poem are kind of overlooked because the raven is the main symbol. So first, we have the bust of Pallas, probably the most well-known symbol in the raven, besides the raven, obviously. When the raven initially comes in, it sits on the bust of Pallas, who full name is Pallas Athena. Pallas Athena is a Greco-Roman goddess of wisdom, and that's what most people point out when analyzing the bust of Pallas, because the narrator at the beginning of the poem is kind of lost in his emotions over Lenore. The raven kind of brings rationality and wisdom and clarity to the narrator's situation. And this source I found is by Patricia Merivale, kind of tying it into the Gothic aesthetic of the poem. It takes the symbols of the classical period and kind of twists them and morphs them to create horror and fascination. So in this context, while the raven on the bust of Pallas brings wisdom and clarity to the narrator's situation, it's not necessarily what he wants to hear. It doesn't give him any comfort. And the next one is the narrator of the raven makes multiple references to the night's Plutonian shore. Pluto, in this context, is referring to the Greco-Roman god of the underworld. Again, another classical figure that is being cast in another context in the Gothic movement. And in the poem itself, he believes that the raven has actually come up from the underworld. Next is Seraphim, and here we are getting into a lot of biblical allusions in the poem. There are a lot of these, and we'll touch on why that is later. Seraphim are the highest angels in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. They're very powerful and intimidating figures, again, going back to the Gothic horror and twisting of classical symbols. It's kind of ironic when they are featured, they kind of create an atmosphere of hopelessness, even though they're, angels. And I found an article by Imran Waqid Haritz and Ulfa Rizkatina Sari, which was not initially written in English, so any typos that you see are translation issues, really giving explanation to Poe's religious symbolism in the raven. And we'll get into why that is in this next one, Balm in Gilead, uttered during the narrator's monologue to the raven, addressing the raven, pleading for relief. Balm in Gilead is generally referred to in a healing context. It says it becomes the traditional medicine and cures the pain. And in searching up why there are so many religious allusions in The Raven, I found that the poem was written about 10 years after the Second Great Awakening, which was a very emotional religious revival in America in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And I found this website that said, the Second Great Awakening is best known for its large camp meetings that led extraordinary numbers of people to convert through an enthusiastic style of preaching and audience participation. During this time, emotion and religion were very intrinsically connected. So I think Poe was kind of going off of that emotion because he knew that if he included religion, he could get emotion, especially if he took the symbols that so many people were fervently worshipping at the time. Granted, it had died down, but I imagine the emotion was still there. If he took the symbols that people were so fervently worshipping at the time and kind of turned them on its head, instead of bringing hope, they bring fear, he could get an even more emotional response for people and really put them in the mental state of the narrator. Loneliness, despair, everything that once brought him hope is now bringing him despair. And one more religious reference Eden is referring to Eden, or the Garden of Eden, the earthly paradise inhabited by Adam and Eve. And again, religious symbol, kind of what everyone in the Second Great Awakening was aspiring to. It's paradise. It's heaven on earth, basically. It's what the narrator wants, and it's what the raven eventually shuts down. It's not clear if the raven implies that Lenore is not in heaven, but the raven definitely implies that the narrator is not. And here are my works cited, a lot of definitions. I hope you enjoyed.